Welcome back, everybody, to We Are TPM with myself, Kyle Teixeira, sitting next to John Teixeira. We are back with another episode of We Are TPM, and this week we are going to be discussing Section 8 Housing Assistance Program. If you have any questions about that, you want to talk about anything we discussed today or in any other episode, or just want to give us a call, 817-818-9039. Shoot us an email at showmethemoney@wearetpm.com. Let's get into it, John. What was that long named program that I just stated?
Section 8 Housing Assistance. So before we get into that, we clearly we're ready for vacation, summer vacation, aren't we?
Yep.
We are.
We found out we found out Steve put the beach background on us, so we
got the
decided
palm
to get
trees back there, so we're going
getting in the beach vibes today.
It's kind of bright in here.
Yeah, it is a little bright, so got the shades on.
Steve's got the studio lights going, so we decided we were going to rock the shades today. So housing assistance, this is interesting because people either know about this or they don't know about it. So this is an old program. It goes way back. I remember when I was young man, not a young boy, but a young man. I had an uncle that he rented homes. He bought homes. He rented. His whole business model was just renting to Section 8 clients or Section 8 tenants. And kind of had a stigma back then. And now that we do this, what we do for a living, we know this program and how it works really well inside and out, right? Mm-hmm. And that's why we decided to bring this to people to share it with them, because there's probably a lot of misconceptions, both good and bad, about housing. And we're probably the ones that can clear those up.
Yeah, I mean, let's just start with baseline what it is, right? So we know what it is. Other people might have heard about it, but the Section 8 housing voucher is basically a government assistance program that you have to, submit an application for and get accepted into, where at a base level, the government pays a portion of your rent to the landlord directly, up to 100%. Sometimes it's 100% of the rent. That's as simple as I can put it, right? Sounds awesome, right?
It does, and I think it's part of the Fair Housing Act. I'm not. It goes back to like 1968, I think, or something like that. I believe that's when the Fair Housing Act was enacted. But the Section 8 is a federally mandated act, I believe, that allows for the local entities to create their own housing authorities and probably funds them with money, right?
And to some extent requires the cities and counties to create these authorities.
Yeah, so let's talk about the authorities first before we get into the program too much, because the programs differ according to the authorities. So each authority has some liberties in how they dish out money, how their programs work. Some of them have some interesting programs that try to encourage home ownership. But in essence, the individual cities and counties can all have their own authority, and they actually overlap sometimes. Well,
and I think it's important to emphasize what you said about it being a federal program. So there's this baseline starting point that the federal program requires all across the board, and then it can, be added on to by the cities and counties. So we're going to, it can differ from state to state too. That's why I emphasize that. So our experience is mainly with the housing authorities in the DFW Metroplex.
Yep. So. Yep. We are registered with all the authorities near us, and they all operate a little differently, right? But under the same premise and under the same general guidelines. So, in essence, a potential tenant can go and apply for this housing, and if they're approved, like you said, for a portion of their rent or all of their rent based on their income status, they'll literally have their rent paid for them every single month.
Mm-hmm. And it's based on an application and qualification process. So, it's however much they approve. It gets completely paid for.
Well, let's get into how this works first
Okay.
of all, and then we could talk about whether we think. I want to kind of end with should you be doing this, right?
Mhm.
Should you be accepting these tenants? And so let's talk a little bit about how it works. And there's a stigma I think that some people have about Section 8 or housing vouchers that they are going to trash my house, right? They are not good tenants. They're not going to keep keep up the home real well.
Well, and some of
Let's
that
talk about that a little bit.
some of that opinion comes from the philosophy, or I guess the mindset of thinking this tenant, if they're using a housing voucher, then they can't afford rent by themselves. And what makes me think that they'll be able to afford the landscaping bill and the maintenance items that the tenant is required for, like keeping up with the outdoor landscaping, cleaning the house, having time to do all that. That's what they think, without realizing that this program takes all of that into account. So like when they qualify somebody to see how much they can afford of the rent, how much they're going to cover, they they account for, okay, this is budgeted, the landscaping is budgeted, the cleaning is budgeted, and your food's budgeted. They basically create a life budget for somebody
Utilities,
and see
yep,
how much left you
everything.
have for rent and how much they're going to cover. I mean, it's
Yep.
yeah, I'm not going to speak specific to their qualification process, but that's in general how it goes. So, or what they're looking at. So I'm just saying they're considering those things that you're also considering,
Yeah.
because they know that these landlords want, that's a priority, because at the end of the day, the housing program needs them to be good tenants, because we can get into how it works, but they're somewhat liable for
Well,
if they're not good tenants.
I want to get into that what were just alluding to, but here let's dig into this misconception a little bit more,
Okay.
okay? Because it's got some validity to it, right? If you alluded to it, if somebody can't afford to pay their rent, maybe they don't have the know-how or the life skills to also take care of a home properly, right, and maintain a home. I think that's a reasonable assumption. It's an assumption that somebody can't do that, but it's somewhat reasonable for a homeowner to connect those dots a little bit, right? And there's probably stories that people have told and run around. People like to run around bad stories, right?
There's
I had a
always stories. In
Section
this
8
industry.
tenant and they trashed the house. Well, yeah.
Well,
I'm not going to say it doesn't happen, but what were you going to say?
the real question is a statistical one. Does it happen more often in a Section 8 tenant than a regular one? Because like those same stories, you've had a Section 8 tenant trash your house. Well, okay, how many regular tenants have trashed your house? Probably the same, number. I've in doing a ton of these, basically we haven't seen any correlation between them being a Section 8 tenant or not being a Section 8 tenant and how the property ends up. So.
On the contrary, actually, I feel like so far what we've got extensive experience with these tenants and dealing with these housing authorities. And from my experience, I actually feel like that the tenants are more trustworthy to take care of the home and take care of things because A, they can afford to do it because the housing authority is paying their rent. B, they don't want to lose their assistance. That's one of the things people don't realize is the housing authority holds them accountable to maintain this assistance. They do inspections of the home. Both the tenant and the landlord have reasonable requirements and expectations to maintain the home, and I've never found any of the requirements that they ask for to be unreasonable. And if the tenant doesn't abide by those things, they're going to lose their benefits.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the biggest points of the stigma is kind of what you were getting into there is they do have annual inspections that walk through to have a certain standard of habitability, cleanliness, all that stuff. Your managers can do that too, but the point is that this housing authority is upholding a standard versus there's no, in a regular lease tenancy, there's the standard of that lease, but there's no secondary authority also backing it up, or even a third if you have a property manager. So it's an added. You're getting guaranteed money. We can get into all the pieces, but there's pros and cons. But a lot of the cons that people don't do it for are not as accurate as I guess what we're saying in our opinion.
Well, there's competing forces. Okay,
Yeah.
So while people make a good point that the people that are on housing sometimes can feel, and I've seen this, they can feel somewhat entitled to that benefit, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like they're deserved that benefit for some reason, and they have that attitude of entitlement that a lot of people loathe, right? And so while that happens, they correlate that to mean that they are also not going to take care of the home, when we have the competing force of, you know what? If you don't want to lose this benefit, you've got to act a certain way. That kind of polices it. Polices it a lot.
Well, it does, and I mean, even if the landlord finds out that it's not meeting a standard of their standard of condition and all that stuff, that can execute a process to remove them from that home. And people underestimate how much appreciation these tenants often have, especially in a competing metroplex like this. Once they actually get in a house that they like, it is really hard for them to not just quickly but at all get into another housing assistance unit, because the landlords have to be willing to take this, and oftentimes they're not very. There's not proper information is given or out there that you have to be first enrolled as a Section 8 house before people can apply for it, and there's various ways that can go.
You make a really good point, and I hope maybe podcasts like this or information that people put out like this will help this problem. But to your point, Kyle, there's not enough education about what it is as there is landlords, right? So there's a lot of landlords out there. They're managing their own properties. I think 9 out of 10 manage their own properties. They don't know what this is. And every home that I get phone calls every single time. Do you take housing? Do you take a voucher? Do you take Section 8? Those are all the same thing, by the way.
Mm-hmm.
Every single one, I get those phone calls. And I have standard answers that I can answer. I know what they're asking me before they even ask it. The standard homeowner that just has one house to rent, he may not have any idea what it is, may not care, doesn't want anything to do with it. Maybe he's got really conservative ideals and he hates the whole idea of paying somebody's rent, so it wasn't anything to do with it, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, there's a whole bunch of attitudes that could go into, or misunderstandings that could go into that. And so, given that, it makes it extremely hard for these tenants to find, for two reasons, to find homes to live in. They work really hard, I find. The ones that get into the homes, the ones we put in our homes, they just worked harder than everybody else to get there, and they were more diligent and they were faster.
Well, because it's the other thing to consider, and I guess this could be in our pros and cons conversation, but it is a longer race for them. It's a different race that they have to do to get into these homes, and that's one of the things that stops landlords sometimes from even doing it. It is work on the landlord side where it wouldn't be with a normal tenant. Like, you pass an inspection before they'll approve the lease and signing, and if the house is missing some things that needs to meet their standards, you now have to do those before you even have a confirmed lease, and you have to wait a little bit for the first rent payment because the government initially doesn't work quickly for things like payables. But those are things you can get through. The trade-off there is, statistically, and for the reasons we are describing right now, these tenants stay for at least 2 leases, right? Like, it is very rare that they go all through all this work and
They stay for a long
they're
time.
looking to move out on the next lease, and that's just being very conservative with that comment. They generally stay way longer than normal tenants because of how hard this is. So they appreciate that they've gotten in somewhere, right?
You're right, Kyle. They stay forever. It takes them so long to get in, so hard to find a home. And once they're there, they stay there for years. I think our average is 3.5 years total with over our entire portfolio, I believe. I believe that's what it is. I would be surprised if we just took our housing tenants out if it's not much higher than that, like maybe twice as high, maybe 5 years, 6 years. I would be surprised if the average for housing tenants isn't way higher.
I mean, because we kind of brushed over how it works, but the portion that comes from housing, from that housing authority, comes on the first, direct deposit into your bank account. It's as guaranteed as a U.S. Treasury bond, so.
It's there every month. It's actually there like on the 28th, isn't it?
No, it's
It's
it's like anything else. It's on the first, unless it's the first on a weekday, and then it's that Monday. But you get it. After that initial period where, I'll admit, so usually when we start with a housing tenant, we'll get we get 2 months of rent
because we're already registered with them.
Yeah, correct. But once the registration process goes through, even if they have to catch up, they've signed a contract to promise you that, so they get it caught up, right? So if you're okay with those delay, these are the pros and cons and tiny things that stop people from doing it, because you're giving up some control. That's the most common, that really all of these things come down to, is the landlord is giving up some control over the lease requirements and their tenant, right?
Yep.
So
That's
you're
one of the
bringing a party
downsides.
in that is a trade-off of, we're going to guarantee you government money for rent, and we can have some restrictions over you and your lease.
And to your point, they have an addendum to the lease that you have to sign. So there's other stipulations that you wouldn't normally put in your lease that you have to sign and agree to. So there's that. You're losing some control over how you present your tenancy.
Yeah, there's some requirements of market rents. So, it's not that you can't increase rents when housing tenant, like fair market rent goes up, you send a rent increase to the housing authority.
You need
and
60 days notice instead of 30.
Yeah, there's some notice requirements, but you follow the process, and, you still get that market rent. If you want to be somebody who thinks they can get $300-400 over market and inflate your rent prices, we can talk about a whole bunch of reasons why that won't work, but housing won't allow you to do that. So it's not necessarily rent controlled. It's just they have to be able to. It's kind of like when you go protest your value at the housing or at the appraisal district, you protest it by justification. Housing authority does the same thing.
When we send in our RFTA, that's a request for tenant approval, they ask for comps.
Yeah.
So we present those comps to them, those comparable homes that were leased, and the amounts and when they were leased. And so they're doing an evaluation based on the current market value. And if you've got something to justify it, to your point, then
some of these, they're all safeguards, right? Like, if you think about it, those are your tax dollars. Would you like for us to be able to request someone who has housing assistance to double the rent just because the government's taking it or paying it? Like, no, you wouldn't. So it's there's a lot of opinions on what you might think about the program existing and that it being used, but that's not the point. This is the pros and cons of how it works.
And there's some fraud you got to be careful of, and some things that people do. But so let's talk about, Kyle. Like, I have a house, and I've never done a housing tenant. Like, I want to talk about this because this is one of the reasons why tenants have a hard time finding homes, and it's one of the misconceptions probably. Is I've never done housing. I don't know anything about it. It sounds scary. I feel like they're going to come in and they're going to do this big this inspection and make me do a whole bunch of things that I don't want to do or I don't think I need to do. And I'm going to need to buy new windows and all this stuff, right? I've heard people just spew all this. And so they foresee it being a huge ordeal. Let's talk about that process a little bit. I have a new house. It's never had housing before. Okay, first, but let's back up. I have a house that's had housing before. That's extremely easy, right? It's already in their system. They know the home. Boom. I just put another tenant in. Go. It's extremely easy to do that house. Now I have a house that's never had housing. That address needs to be registered and inspected by that housing authority.
Yeah, and taking it a step higher, you need to be, even less already in situation as if you're not registered with the housing authority, because
Right.
they register landlords. So yeah, now you're looking at registering with the housing authority as a landlord, property manager, whatever it is, and then applying to have the house registered.
And inspected.
But that can be done all at the same time, right? So it can be done in parallel. So even if you haven't gone through this process before, they can be approving the tenant while they're approving the house and the lease while they're approving you as a landlord. So it can all really happen at the same time.
So it does take a couple weeks. So this is the rub in some markets. And maybe not all markets, normal markets. Like right now, it's probably not as much of a pain point, but it has been in the past, right? One of the reasons we used to have a informal kind of policy that we didn't accept housing tenants on vacant homes, right? So we would accept applications on homes that already were tenant occupied and we had a move out date for. And the reason for that was because the amount of time it took to get them approved, get the RFTA in, go through the process with housing.
Didn't add time.
It didn't add vacancy days. And usually in that market that I'm referring to, we had 12 applicants, 8 of which were good applicants ready to move in tomorrow. Why would I even consider waiting a couple weeks for a housing? Like, you know what I mean? Like the economics of it made it so that if I had a vacant home, I almost couldn't consider it. Now, we're in a more normal market now where things aren't as crazy. And that's, so now I'm probably going to take me a couple weeks to get a home filled anyways. So if my first application is a housing applicant, it's definitely something to consider in a market like we're in right now.
Yeah, and let me play a little bit of devil's advocate. Even I can find either pro, even if in that situation, is if you're that much more likely to retain this tenant over a longer period of time, you may be saved by taking the vacancy days now that it takes. You could be saving yourself
turnovers
and far more vacancies down the road. And this isn't just a could be. I mean, statistically, you are more likely to be saving yourself vacancy days down the road. So that's just playing the other side of that. So because this is all the things people think about, but if you don't have the facts of what actually happens and how it actually works, you can't really take those concerns home.
Kyle, we sound like advocates of this program.
I know, which is weird, and we're not advocates. I wouldn't. This is opinion. It's
a tool to accomplish what we want to accomplish.
Well, and what we're property
managers.
Our opinion doesn't matter in what we do. We have to. If the landlord wants to take it, then we take it. If the landlord doesn't want to take it, we don't take it. That's our stance operationally.
But we don't discourage our homeowners from accepting it, and I mean they allow us to make those decisions for them. That's what they pay us to do. So we accept our housing tenants, and
unless
we don't make the rules that they live under. We didn't make the laws that created the authorities. We don't run the authorities. We don't make those decisions, and so all we're doing is providing homes potentially for those tenants. and considering their application. We don't even have to take their application.
Yeah. Well, and I'll take another point we haven't even brought up that, I guess the hardship of it, because there is some fraud, but there's way more programs out there that have way more fraud than, in my opinion, than this one, because it's so hard to get. People also don't appreciate it's hard to find the house for all the reasons we've already talked about. Getting a housing voucher is probably the hardest part of the entire process. The way that works with pretty much every authority, it works differently timeline-wise and all those things, but in general, they have an open application period that in a wait list, right? So you could wait years to even apply, and then you have to go through that process, and maybe you get approved. But most people that we know and have gotten a housing voucher, it took them initially years to get into that program. And I've never heard of someone who's like, I got applied and, well, I can't say never. There was some exceptions during the pandemic, but in general, that's how it works. There's an enrollment period, and there's only a certain number of people that can get into this program. It has a cap. It has a monetary cap. So...
And they have rules to protect themselves. And one of the things I'm sitting here thinking about, some of the things that I've often have tenants ask me and try to get me to do. So I would imagine, and we don't do this, but I would imagine that Joe Blow homeowner might do this and get themselves in trouble. Although they're not licensed and they're not running a business, so I don't know what their trouble would be. But it is fraud to do some of this stuff. And like, for instance, you may have a home for $2,000 a month and a tenant has a voucher for $1,800 and they really want that home. So they may come to you and say, I've got a voucher for $1,800. Will you take it? And the homeowner says, no, I'm renting for $2,000. And then the tenant says, well, I'll pay you $200 cash.
Yeah, you can't do that.
That's fraud. You can't do that.
Yeah.
The housing authority specifically prohibits you from doing that. They put you on a budget and they want you to stay within your housing budget.
Yeah, and you shouldn't do that, because then it means, well, then where is that? If they budgeted that in, where's it coming from? And why would you think that after they tore these people's lives apart as far as where they spend their money and where they're going to be allowed to in order to get approved in this program, and you're going to trust that they're going to pay you that extra money? The housing authority would have given them that gap if they could afford it. Is really where that comes in. And that's the other point that a lot of people don't know. Like, oh, these people got a voucher, and then they did everything they needed to get a voucher, and then now they're taking advantage of the program because they went back to their jobs or whatever. They reconfirm this every year. When they do that inspection, they analyze,
reevaluate,
and we get letters as the landlord or the manager of the program.
Changed.
They get the letters of, we did the reanalyze this, and now the tenant's payment's this, and this is what our payment is. We've seen it go both ways. We've seen a tenant's portion go to 0. We've seen a tenant's portion go to 100, and basically telling us they're no longer in the program after this term, and because now they don't qualify. They've essentially lost their voucher for good reasons, for reasons that now they can afford their own rent. So,
yeah, and if I could just go on a quick tangent, I'm sitting here thinking about that homeowner right now that I just described, because you're absolutely right, Kyle. That the program is set up with good intentions, but people try to skirt around the rules, right? The tenants do, and the homeowners do. If you're that homeowner and you're considering doing something like this, don't. For so many reasons. One. For two, go get a property manager so that you stop making fear-based decisions. You and I talked about these fear-based decisions. Deciding to do that for somebody is a fear-based decision because you think you don't have the certainty to know that you are going to get another applicant that is better qualified. I could probably find for every housing applicant that would do that to me, I can get 10 more that wouldn't and are well qualified and have a voucher for enough money. Why do you feel the need that you have to take a risk, commit fraud, when there is so much opportunity to not commit fraud out there?
It's a great point, and it brings up another thought that it is. A lot of people might think, well, my property's too expensive for a housing voucher, and this is where I'm just not going to.
Oh, that surprises me all the
give
time.
Opinions here, but I'm just going to state the fact that the amounts
insane.
are based on medians in the cities that they're looking, and we have been surprised, is what I
Very
say,
surprised.
from how much these are
Now,
in comparison.
in the past, they have been low. That has been a true statement.
They've been both, but
they've been very low.
But even when they were low, they weren't like below anything that you could find out there.
No, there was a period of time. I didn't mean to be all argumentative, but there was a period of time that I recall where they were so extremely low that I don't think any housing tenants could even find a home.
I actually do remember that to a point, but they've overcorrected that in some.
They have.
There's an opinion.
People tell me they got vouchers now for $2,600 or something for a 3-bedroom. I'm like, what?
It's based on zip code too, and that's where it gets interesting because, if you're a radius of where you've been approved with all these zip codes, you can essentially go choose to live in one zip code or another based on their median home price. So if this median has $1,800, that's what your voucher's for. But if this median's $3,000, that might be what your voucher's for.
And it's interesting. Here's a testament to how hard it is to get tenants into these homes. These authorities will even pay rent in cities that aren't even there. So, for instance, we are registered with the Grand Prairie Housing Authority. They rent homes for people in Arlington and Mansfield. Why do they do that? I don't understand the reason why they do it, other than there's not enough supply for the amount of tenants that they have in their city, so they have to allow their applicants to go outside their city. But Arlington has their own authority. Mansfield uses Tarrant County. I don't really understand it, but that is the truth.
The metroplex of DFW, if this gives you any idea of the overlapping, is you have this, three of some of the biggest cities in the country. You have Fort Worth, you have Dallas, and sandwiched in between them you have Arlington, and splitting those also is Dallas County and Tarrant County. Dallas County, Tarrant County, Arlington, Fort Worth, and Dallas, all of those have a housing authority.
Yep.
And all of those allow you to get a house in pretty much any of those areas. So you have 5 housing authorities over 5 areas. I mean, obviously, Dallas County doesn't overlap into Tarrant County. That's the only exception. But it does overlap into the Fort Worth one and the Arlington one. And then Arlington is pretty much just splitting all of those, and Arlington can go anywhere. So, it brings up another thing. I'll get into why, but still run these people, or the Section 8 tenants should still be ran and screened the exact same way you would a regular person, because that's another misconception. People think that...
What is the difference, though? There is a slight difference in how you might consider
income verification. You don't need to bother with that necessarily, because
the rent's being paid for.
That's one thing the housing authority is doing for you. But the rest of it matters because it can help you catch this fraud. Because I've heard, here's just a story that has been corrected. I'll bring it up because this can't happen anymore due to technology. But in the past, government, not too far in the past, because the government, if you know anything about how the government's technology advances lags behind the rest of the world, you'll believe this point. Those 5 housing authorities, ideally someone who qualified in the past could go get on our 5 housing authorities and get 5 housing houses under the same criteria. I have heard...
We've seen that happen.
We've seen it happen, and it can't happen anymore because now they're smart enough to talk to each other about, hey, this person has a voucher with our authority, and make sure they don't also have one across the street. But yeah, that's fraudulent. And if a property manager ran that person correctly, they would likely see that, oh, they're renting from another manager. Or, we have things like Expedia's rent payment history nowadays that helps property managers see if things are actively being rented elsewhere. So, great reasons to still screen and still do the rest of your process the same.
Good point, Kyle. So we've talked a lot about the do's and don'ts, the procedures, the reasons why, the reasons not to. Are we advocates? Should homeowners and property managers be accepting vouchers from Section 8 tenants?
Well, I'm going to give you the answer that you should probably repeat, is that act you spoke about earlier doesn't make it an opinion-based question. Everybody has to, the property managers have to take it.
Do they? This is news to me. I'm a property manager. I didn't know that.
They shouldn't. They can't have an opinion of whether you should or not. We have to leave that up to our client. Is essentially
yeah.
what
There's
I'm saying.
fair housing. That's different. Fair housing is different, but we don't. I don't believe we have to accept anybody.
Is it a benefit to your portfolio, or can it be a benefit to your portfolio? I think it is a way of diversifying risk inside of your long-term rental portfolio. Yes, I think that is a great way to diversify the risk, because you have some pieces of guaranteed rent. Would I personally ever create a long-term real estate portfolio that had 100% Section 8 rental tenants? No. And that's simply because, like anything else, it's putting your entire portfolio on the U.S. government. It's still low risk historically. That's a low risk, but it's still all in one basket.
Yep. So I like the short answer, Kyle, of absolutely you should be considering and accepting these and in the right situation. The security, you got something to say?
Yeah, I think in talking to property managers across the country of why they may or may not do this, I think it's worth pointing out that one of the biggest problems I've heard of people not taking it that would otherwise is just some housing authorities make it so hard, right? And so ask somebody experienced, if you're not in what we just talked about, of how that is, because that's the only caveat I would agree with. If the housing authority takes 6 months to put a tenant in, then somebody needs to go help fix the housing authority.
We've had some problems with some of the housing authorities, and it gives us pause on accepting applicants that they're using that authority. So absolutely, that comes with experience, right? So we're talking in a very generalized term. If you're in, I don't know, Sioux, North Dakota, you probably have a completely different authority and different situation than we do here, right?
Yeah, I mean, but and you never know what's going to happen. The one of the reasons our housing authorities I would never call them great, but in comparison, all the rent relief programs that happened during the pandemic were essentially ran by these housing authorities. Yep. They were essentially executed as a whole. So I'll say in the Metroplex, all 5 of those I just mentioned all became, while still doing their normal job, essentially became staff of the Texas rent relief program, right? And you could be talking to someone from different housing authority every time you call. Because it was essentially the same program and the same process that operated or happened, I'd say, somewhat better in Texas than some.
Well, I don't know. We only know Texas experience, but what the impressive thing is, these people that we deal with on a daily basis, when it came time to COVID and we had crisis time, you know where they were? They were spending their days in court so that they were readily available to the people that needed them being evicted. They were in eviction court, sitting right there in the court with a desk. The judge would point to them and said, "Have you spoken to that person yet?" I mean, they became a part of the solution during a really tough time.
Well, it was interesting because it wasn't the first. It was the solution of Texas rent relief, and we've gone off on a little tangent. Was a crapshoot for the first year. What made the state say the housing authority needs to take this over and execute it so it gets done was when the Supreme Court knocked it down and said, you got 2 weeks and this moratorium is gone. People don't realize that happened in Texas months, in some cases over a year before it happened across the country. And they're like, all right, well, we're sitting on $1 billion plus of money that we can't distribute. And now you're looking at an eviction timeline of 30 days. So they're like, we need to get this money in landlords' hands within 30 days, or they're going to be having these people out. So it was interesting to see, because that was their solution. What they should have done a year prior, probably. Let's let the housing authorities that do this exact thing every day take care of it.
So back to our simple question, should they do it? I think it provides security for homeowners. So if you're the type of landlord that is averse to the security, you don't have a bunch of cash on hand, you're really worried about whether that rent payment comes in every month, accepting one of these applicants takes some of that away from you and gives you the security to know that you are going to have that money in your bank every single month. Like
a majority of it, yeah.
Even when tenants pay a portion of it, it's usually a small portion. So it's a small enough portion that we rarely have instances where the tenant doesn't pay on time. Because you know what? That's another guideline of housing. If they're consistently late, right, on their portion, housing wants to know about it, and that affects their benefits. Mm-hmm. All of their activities, all of the things they do affect their benefits, and that's the last thing they want to do. So at least from a financial standpoint, taking care of the home, all that stuff, they actually are really good stewards of it all.
Yeah, and it's, there's restrictions from the authority, but that doesn't mean you can't still execute, say, an eviction for lease violations as you would need to in another tenant. So yeah.
I think to wrap it up and to answer the question, we're proponents of it. We think that in most cases, and it's case by case, house by house basis, and I think in most cases it's a great idea. I think in some markets, like I've mentioned, where things are just flying off the market, maybe you don't do your vacant homes, maybe you do your tenant occupied homes and get them ready, to move in after the tenant leaves. If you're having trouble getting qualified applicants in a tough market, then you should be more apt to it. And that's what I mean by it depends on the situation and the market and everything. But the point is, forget the stigmas that you've heard, the negative stigmas. Don't worry about that stuff. Don't be afraid to go through this process and be open to it, so that it's another tool that you have in your belt and another opportunity you have to reduce your vacancy days and build wealth for your family with your rental property.
Yep. Great way to diversify that portfolio. So, and if you're worried about the demand factor, I'll tell you, in our experience, especially in this area, there are more people with vouchers than are able to use them. Yep. Yeah. I mean, and I'm not going to tell people how to feel about that, but maybe for you, that's a reason to or not do it as well. So,
yep.
But diversify, because guaranteed money's good.
Good subject. How come we never did this before?
I don't know. Maybe we didn't want to.
Just too simple, huh?
Yeah.
Good job, Kyle. Close us out.
Yeah. Well, thank y'all for tuning in. If you want to ask if we take Section 8, give us a call, 817-818-9039. Give us a call to talk about other things as well at 817-818-9039. Shoot us an email at showmethemoney@weartpm.com. Come visit us in downtown Mansfield. But for now, we are out.
Late.